This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello everyone and welcome to another video and welcome to this particular video. This video, my end of year favorite books of the year video, is always my favorite one to film. I look forward to it all year. I get so excited whenever I find a 5-star book, wondering if this is the book that's going to end up on my list. I have 10 books here which I want to share with you. It was really challenging to narrow it down, but I was really good this year. I managed to actually narrow it down to a clean list of 10 books. Without further ado, we're going to jump straight into the video. These are my favorite books that I read in 2022. The very first book we're going to speak about today is Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. This book was on my list for a really long time because I remember hearing Neil Gaiman speak about it a few times in interviews. So Lud-in-the-Mist is a pre-Tolkienian fantasy, which is really significant because when Tolkien published The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, the fantasy genre, or rather the modern fantasy genre as we know it, was basically invented. Like, fantasy wasn't a popular genre, mostly fantasy was just like fairy tale stuff, but this book is really exciting because it was written in the 1920s. 1926 this particular book was written, and it is about a town called Lud-in-the-Mist, which sits right next to fairyland. This is a world where fairies and fairy magic are kind of vaguely known about by the townfolk, but it's very much a taboo subject. So fairy fruit is seen as a very dangerous thing. The main character of this story is Nathaniel Chanticleer. He is the mayor of Lud-in-the-Mist. He's a very stuffy man. He's like not the type of person you would think would get involved with anything magical or mischievous. But he, since he was a teenager, has heard the musical sound of fairy music, which is called like the note. He at one point was a teenager and he was exploring the attic in his house and he played this lute and he heard the note of fairy music, and this sound has haunted him his whole life, and he sort of pretended like he didn't hear this thing, it wasn't a problem, until he's essentially middle-aged and he's the mayor, and without giving away any spoilers, magic comes back to impact his life in a very significant way. It's quite a slow read, this book, but it's really magical. Again, I love the way it's written. I think it's just beautiful and very fairy tale-esque, and there's some little funny bits as well with the characterization. I love the variety of the characters in this book. I love the sort of mysterious way that fairyland was depicted here. It was magical and really special and incredibly unique. Book number 9 on this list is The 7 Skins of Esther Wilding. I think it's really hard for you to see the cover. I'll put the actual cover of the published book here. This is the second novel by Holly Ringland, and if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I absolutely love The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart, which was her debut novel. As soon as I found out Holly Ringland was coming out with the second book, I put in a request to get an advance reader copy, and I was really happy when they sent me this book, and I absolutely loved it. The 7 Skins of Esther Wilding is essentially a novel about grief and healing and sisterhood and families. The story is about a young woman whose name is Esther, who has to return home to coastal Tasmania, who essentially has to come home and process her grief after her sister went missing and is now presumed dead. It's a really poignant, beautiful story. I think the biggest strength of Holly Ringland for me is her natural imagery. The way she writes Australia, the way she depicts the flora and fauna, I think is so incredibly beautiful. I have never read any other writer who depicts Australia in this just stunning, atmospheric way. Like, I cannot get over how much I love Holly Ringland's imagery, her figurative language. I love that this is a really vulnerable story, and there's also a really significant theme of fairy tales and folklore here, and the ways that stories are passed down through the generations, and the significance of storytelling and what stories mean to us. Such a healing book to read. I thought it was really lovely. And again, if you love natural imagery, I very, very, very much suggest this book, but also I recommend The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart as well, because I think it's brilliant and I want more people to read it. Book number 8 on this list is Julia and the Shark by Kieran Millward Hargrave, which you would remember me reading if you watched the reading vlog I put up towards the beginning of the year. This book really drew me in because the cover was very beautiful. I loved the yellow. I loved the fact that it's illustrated. This book is a middle grade story, and it's the story of Julia, who goes with her parents, her mum and her dad, to the very, very north of Scotland, to Shetland, I believed. I almost forgot the name, and then I was like, wait, no, the ponies, the little horses, they're from that place. Because her mother is a marine biologist who's looking for this really, really old Greenland shark. Greenland sharks are these beautiful old sharks that can live to be an extremely old length of age. I think they're pretty magical. I think they're really cool. And so when I found out this book was about a Greenland shark, I was like, yes, I love love this, let's go read this book. What I loved about it was how surprisingly poignant it was, and I can't tell you specifically what I loved about it because it's a spoiler, but this book has a very surprising amount of depth to it that I absolutely loved. It's a really, again, emotionally vulnerable book. I like emotionally vulnerable books. So from Julia's perspective, of course, there's a really sweet little friendship that happens in here. I really love the metaphor of her mother searching for this shark and searching and searching, and there was just so much to love about this book. I thought it was absolutely stunning. I loved the imagery. I loved the way it was written. I thought it was incredibly engaging. There's these stunning little illustrations that were done by Tom DeFreston. I'm pretty sure that's her partner. Visually, to read this book, it's beautiful, but the story is very poignant. Before we jump into the rest of the books on this list, I just wanted to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is a website builder which allows you to create beautiful and interesting websites with ease. As many of you know, my website was built through Squarespace. Towards the beginning of this year, I added a shop for the very first time, and I was blown away by how easy this was to set up and how quickly I got everything working exactly as I wanted. The whole thing honestly took like 20 minutes. I didn't need a single tutorial, and I love the way that everything turned out. The e-commerce interface was super easy to use, and the whole process has just been an absolute dream. Squarespace also has heaps more benefits, including powerful blogging tools and in-depth analytics. If you're looking to make a website, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Christy and Jones to save 10% off your purchase of a website or domain. The very next book on this list, which is my 7th favorite book of 2022, is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I read this book as a part of a reading vlog towards the start of the year as well and loved it. I was so blown away by this story. I picked it up because it was really popular, because I'd heard it was so incredibly significant to the magical realism genre. I love magical realism, and lots of people had recommended this book to me. I was blown away by how much I loved it. The thing that I love the very most about the story, which I've mentioned before, is the compression of the prose. Like, I feel like Gabriel Garcia Marquez manages to make this extremely epic story fit into a very small number of words. Like, if you just read a chapter of this book, it feels like so much happens and everything that happens is really impactful. I love the characters here. The characters were written in such a way that there was a lot of brevity. Like, there wasn't a lot about each character because there's so many characters, but it felt like each character had depth and they were unique and they were interesting and believable. And that's really significant because so many of the characters in this book have the same names. The men of this particular family are named Jose Arcadio Buendia, or they're named Aureliano Buendia, and so it is a little bit confusing, but the fact that their characterization was so well done, I think, was a really, really big tick for this book. The basic premise of the book is that we're following the Buendia family over the course of roughly 100 years. The Buendia family live in rural Colombia, and they build this house, and next to this house, this village ends up growing. There's a lot of people who suggest that this book is the big inspiration for the movie Encanto. We don't talk about Bruno, but in Japanese is like the biggest bop in the world. I love it so much. It's on my playlist. It gets played a lot. This book is about the Buendia family and the many generations of the Buendia family as they live in this house. So many things happen in this town. There are wars that come and go. There are moments of violence. There are moments of magic. They have these peddlers bringing magic carpets and things to the town. The way that death is dealt with in this book is incredibly interesting. I think it was so incredibly unique and beautifully written, and I wish I had have read this book sooner. It's so magical. It's so wonderful. My 6th favorite book of 2022 is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I'm realizing that it would have been more fun to place this 7th. Evelyn Hugo is such a brilliant book. Absolutely lived up to the hype for me. I thought it was really powerful, and I cried quite a bit while reading this book, and I thought it was just brilliantly done. The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is about an aging film star whose name is Evelyn Hugo, who approaches a young journalist and asks her to write her life story. The young journalist's name is Monique. She's not really sure why Evelyn Hugo, who's kind of this like Marilyn Monroe type actress who's like really, really famous and really rich and has a really successful career. Monique has no idea why she's been approached, but Evelyn promises her that there's a really important and special reason why this has happened. And so as Evelyn is interviewed by Monique, we find out her life story. We find out about her 7 husbands and the journeys she went on throughout her life and how she ended up in these relationships, ended up leaving these relationships, and it was just beautiful. I thought it was such an engrossing read. I got sucked into this book so quickly. Like, as soon as I started reading it, I could not put it down. I loved it. I thought it was so engaging. I loved Evelyn's character. I loved how nuanced she was. I loved the really nuanced way that this book looks at love, and I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was so good, so worth the hype, such a brilliant book, and just It was good. I cried a lot. I cried a lot in the ending. Getting down to my 5th favorite book on the list, and this is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is probably my most anticipated book of the year. I was really excited for this book to come out. This book is described as being a setting response to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and a thematic response to The Secret History. And if you guys have watched many of my previous videos, you'll know that those are 2 of my favorite books. And so when I read that little byline on Goodreads, I was like, oh my god, I'm so excited to read this. I loved it. I thought it was brilliantly done. I loved the way that magic worked in this story. The premise of this book is that we have a young man whose name is Robin Swift. He is born in Canton in China in the 1800s. I was about to say spirited away, but not spirited away. He is essentially picked up out of his house by a scholar whose name is Professor Lavelle and taken to England, to Oxford to study, to prepare for entrance into Oxford University and the particular college within Oxford University where the professor wants him to go, which is called Babel. Babel is a special magical college within Oxford. It's obviously not real. This is a secondary world fantasy. Babel is a college where people use translation as a means for magic. Oh, the magic system is really cool in this book. It's essentially like they have these little silver bars and they have a word in one language on one side of the bar, and then they have the translation of that word in another language on the other side of the bar, but there needs to be some slight shift in the meaning of the word. Often words don't have direct perfect translations. And so when you have a word that has like a vague change in meaning but it's still a translated word, that's when you get magic coming out of it, and the word also informs the magic. It was a really complex and unique magic system and I loved it. I thought it was so interesting. And this book also looks at translation as a act of betrayal as well. There's a really strong theme of colonialism. It explores that theme and also racism as well. I think it was a really powerful story. My 4th favorite book of the year was I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. I listened to this book as an audiobook and I was so captivated by Jennette's story. It was such a powerful book. So I'm Glad My Mum Died is a memoir by Jennette McCurdy about her experiences of growing up as a child star. So Jennette McCurdy was on iCarly among other. I didn't actually ever watch iCarly growing up. Like in Australia, in order to have access to that kind of stuff, you had to pay for Foxtel, which was like really, really expensive TV. And so I didn't grow up watching a lot of Nickelodeon or Disney Channel. And so I never had either of them, which meant that I never actually watched iCarly growing up. So I didn't have the context of having seen her character as Sam on iCarly from when I was a kid, but I really loved getting to see this insight into her life and her experiences, and she speaks very vulnerably about her experiences with her mother. Her mother was really emotionally abusive, very controlling, abusive in other ways as well. When she was talking about her experiences as a 7-year-old, she was speaking about it from the perspective of a 7-year-old rather than looking at it now with adult eyes. And through doing that, she also makes the book incredibly humorous as well. And so I really loved that light and shade in this book. There are some bits that are really darkly funny, and then there are other bits that are just harrowing and heartbreaking, and I felt so much for her. I feel really honored that she wrote this book and she shared so much of her story. Child abuse is obviously an incredibly vulnerable topic for people to speak about, and I think it's really powerful that she wrote this book, and I think it's really important as well. And I loved the way she wrote it. I thought the style of it was really engaging. I went down a real deep dive. God, this is Christy versus all the distractions of living where she lives today. What was I talking about? Because I don't remember. Jennette McCurdy. I'm glad my mum died. If you are a person who needs content warnings, you should definitely look at them up before you read this book, particularly around stuff to do with eating and body image. This book is quite heavy, so I think if you're a person who finds that particular topic a bit triggering, a bit confronting, either read this book when you're in a really good headspace or just have a look at some of the content warnings for this book, because it is quite confronting. It is really sad what she went through, the way her mother encouraged her behavior. Oh, that's what I was gonna say. I went on a deep dive of watching Jennette McCurdy interviews, and I basically watched like every interview that like came out during Jennette McCurdy's like media run that she did for this book, and it was appalling to me how unkind some of the interviewers were to her, how much they questioned the title of her book, how they approached the questioning. I thought it was wild that so many of the interviewers hadn't actually read the book before interviewing her, and so I felt really bad for her for that. Anyway, I love this book. I thought it was so wonderful. I think her writing's amazing. I think she did a great job. It's a really harrowing story and powerful. How many times do I use the word powerful? Regardless, I loved it. Please go read it. My third favorite book of 2022 was The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. And I picked this book up kind of on a whim. I had seen it kicking around for a really long time, and I loved John Green when I was a teenager. I loved Looking for Alaska. I read like all of his like YA books. The way he writes is incredibly accessible to a younger audience while still being really beautiful and thoughtful, and I love a lot of the themes that he explores. I love a lot of the references that he uses. I love that he like puts a lot of like fun facts or interesting things in. I picked up this book because I really like John Green, and I still watch Vlogbrothers. I loved it. I loved this book. I loved listening to the audiobook. I loved that it was narrated by John Green, and this book is essentially a compilation of essays. The Anthropocene is I believe it's the time in which humans have been present on Earth and making changes and affecting things. So the Anthropocene Reviewed is John Green looking at different things that we've made and we've done and we've perceived and reviewing each of them individually. And I think there's 50 reviews in here total, and he reviews things from Dr. Pepper to sunsets to weird and different things like buffalo grass, geese, essays and meditations on a whole bunch of random things, but I loved it. I found it so interesting. It didn't matter that I didn't know what the essays were going to be about. The way he writes is beautiful and really, really engaging, and the way he thinks about the world is so unique and poignant and just stunning. Like I love John Green's writing. I think he's so clever and talented, and I loved it to bits. There's this quote about sunsets and about vulnerability and about showing your belly to the world and not reviewing things poorly as like 1 stars or 2 stars just because you want to be cool and interesting and a critical thinker, and the idea that you can't be vulnerable and you can't be vulnerably enthusiastic about things and love things that are like sunsets. The idea that you're reviewing things and you can't give a sunset 5 stars because it's a cliche is so silly, because sunsets are beautiful. They are, you know, otherworldly in how lovely they are to look at. And so I really loved that little bit of the book specifically and how he explored that. Moving on to my second favorite book of 2022. This is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This book was just mind-blowing and brilliant and wonderful, and I actually managed to meet Shelley Parker Chan when she went to Oz Asia just recently, and she signed the book for me, and she was lovely. She was so kind, and just we had a little chat and we talked about fantasy writing, and I loved meeting her, and she was lovely. Anyway, so this book is set in 1300s China, and we start off with this young girl who's living in an incredibly impoverished village in rural China. So she has her brother and her father, but the rest of her family have already passed away from starvation, and because she is a girl in this family, she sort of gets the scraps of what's left over in terms of the food. Because she's a girl, she's like very low on the social ladder. An incident happens in the village where bandits come to their home and her father is killed, and then her brother ends up dying of starvation. These sound like spoilers, but I swear to God this happens in like the very like opening chapter of the book. And then Zhu ends up being left alone, and she decides that she is going to essentially take her brother's fortune, because her brother had been to a fortune teller and he'd been told that he was going to have a life of greatness. Zhu decides to impersonate her brother, take his fortune, take his promise of greatness, and she goes to a monastery and decides to become a monk. And so she's hiding her gender, she's pretending to be a boy, and it's about her journey as she becomes a monk and as she sort of grows. This book kind of oscillates between Zhu's story and the story of another character whose name is Ouyang, who is a eunuch. So we have these two characters who have really interesting relationships with gender in this particular world at this time. So Ouyang being a eunuch means that he is constantly feminized. People look at him as being almost a woman. He hates that, and so he is the most like vile masculine he could possibly be. He's like this really powerful general, and he's really vicious and violent, and so we sort of see his experience of gender in this world. And then we see Zhu, who has thrown off her femininity in order to also have power in this world. And I think the way that gender was done in this book was so brilliant. I loved it. I love this topic, as many of you guys know. I find it really interesting. This was my research area in my postgrad, gender in fantasy. I love this. I love the book so much. I think it was beautifully written. I love the imagery. I loved particularly the imagery of the monastery that Zhu goes to. It's a wonderful historical fantasy. And then the final book, my favorite book of 2022, is The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. I'm so sad that I don't have a physical copy of this book. I listened to the audio production of this book and I loved it to bits. I feel like I've already spoken about this book so much this year, but this is the story of a young boy whose name is Theo Decker. When he he is a child, so I think he's around the age of 12 or 13. He goes to an art gallery with his mother, and very sadly at the art gallery a terrorist attack happens, which ends up resulting in the death of his mother. Theo wakes up in the rubble of this art gallery, having no idea what's going on, and he wakes up next to this painting, which is the Goldfinch by Carol Fabrices. This is a real painting. Obviously the terrorist attack did not happen, but the painting is real. Theo, in his shock and just having no idea what to do, takes the painting and runs home with it. He eventually finds out that his mother has passed away, and this story ends up following Theo's journey. And so it's a Bildungsroman, it's a coming of age story, and so we see Theo's life and his experiences and the implications of the death of his mother. I love this book. It was huge and it was sprawling and brilliant and such an expansive story. And I've mentioned this before and I'll probably mention it again, but the way that Donna Tartt describes her writing process is that she's painting a really big mural with a very little brush, and I love that metaphor for her because I think it's really indicative of her books and her stories. I think the way that she does imagery is just perfect. It's perfect. I love the way she writes imagery. I love the way she does characters. I love how much I loved the characters in this book. I've just adored Boris. I adored Pop Chick, which is the little dog that Theo ends up meeting. I loved how nuanced the characters were. I loved how interesting it was. I loved the themes of this story, how it explored luck and fortune and art and the art world, like the underground of the art world. I love Donna Tartt so much. I think she's so wonderful. She's such a talented writer. I really want her to come out with a new book soon because she writes a new book every 10 years roughly, and we're almost at the point where it's been 10 years since the Goldfinch. Like, I think the Goldfinch was written in 2014, so hopefully that means that we're due another Donna Tartt book really soon. I think the Goldfinch was amazing, and it was my favorite book that I read this year because I was just so blown away by it. It was so good. It was so very good. That was my list of my 10 favorite books that I read in 2022. Please let me know what books you read this year that you really loved. I get so many book recommendations out of the comments of my videos, so please do feel free to share your favorite books that you've read this year. Thank you very much for watching. An enormous thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting my channel and for supporting these videos. Take care everyone. Happy New Year, happy holidays, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.